All right, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us here at the January PFX Summit. We really appreciate all the participation. We had almost 200 people sign up for this event, so it's really great to see that level of interest and to know that there's a big community of people out there who are focused on preparedness. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, as I said, and also remind you that this is being recorded. We will get this up on our YouTube channel. And we'll probably we'll let everybody know in a week or so when it's posted to the website, so you can watch it again. I also want to thank our partners at the Osteopathic Surgeons of Oregon, or OPSO, who partner with us to make these events happen. We really appreciate all the help and all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes to make this happen. So this month we're focused on the concept 2 weeks ready. And it's probably no surprise to anybody who's on this meeting or in this summit. But the reason why this is such an important topic is because the Pacific Northwest is obviously vulnerable to a very catastrophic seismic event at some point in our future. And so the 2 weeks ready concept is really about making sure that we're prepared, we have a plan, we have the material, we have the resources to take care of ourselves and our family for up to 2 weeks if need be, before help arrives after a major catastrophic seismic event. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about this evening. A couple of things for those that may not be aware. PathFinderEx, just a little bit about us and who we are. We're a veteran-owned nonprofit organization focused on disaster preparedness, education, and training. And one of our big things is basically our whole mission is to create what we call community responders. And a community responder is really just somebody who knows how to prepare themselves, prepare their family, and then wants to walk outside, look up and down the block and see who needs help next in preparation and potentially even in response. And so that's really our whole goal. And one of the things we recognize is that there are barriers to preparedness out there. One of the simplest barriers is just it can feel overwhelming. And so we're going to be talking a lot about that this evening. One of the things that we want to bring attention to is that we do have some products out there to help with preparedness. So we have a series called PFX Prepared. We only have one manual out in this series, but this is going to be an ongoing series for us. And that manual is Neighborhood Ready. The Neighborhood Ready is really all about what I just said: preparing yourself, preparing your family, and preparing your community. And these preparedness guides are really meant to be very, very simple. This manual is only 15 pages long. It links to external resources if you want to go deeper. And it's a great tool to start that conversation, especially for folks who might be feeling overwhelmed. Each topic in the book is only about a page long, and I bet you could read through it in less than 10 minutes. So these products are available on our websites, in our online store. They're all free, no cost. You can just check them out in our store and download them. And we do have some other training tools in there too that are free of charge, and we encourage you to take a look at those as well. But we think this is a pretty good product to start the conversation, and feel free to share it around. One of the areas that we'll be discussing, and also I want to make mention that in the chat there's links to all these things I'm mentioning, so feel free to peruse around the chat and click on some links. One thing that we want to get some feedback on is we're thinking about creating our next PFX Prepared product. And so we have a little survey in the chat just asking you what you would like to hear about, or what's an interesting topic for PFX Prepared for the group. Our three topics that we came up with were business ready, preparing your business; evacuation ready, getting ready to leave on short notice; and volunteer ready. There's a lot of volunteer opportunities out there, and we thought maybe just putting a manual together that sort of is a repository for all of those. Or maybe there's something else that we're not even thinking of, and we'd love to hear what you think. Also, in the link, you'll see the Ultimate Preparedness Guide for pets. Pets also need to be considered in our evacuation plans and our 2 week ready plans as well. So take a look at that link and check it out. Our next summit will be on April 26th between 5 and 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. We want to hear from you on this as well. There is a link if you go to pathfinderex.org/ready, or you just go to our website and click the events button. It'll take you to a page where you can give us some feedback. We're interested in hearing what you want to hear about, and also maybe even who you want to hear from, if there's some interesting speakers out there that we're unaware of. So if you go to our website, click the RSVP button. You're not actually RSVPing for the event, but it will link you to a survey that you can fill out and give us your feedback. And then finally, we want to hear from you. So you can always reach out to us at info@pathfinderex.org. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or you just want to get involved, feel free to reach out to us. Right, so this is what our agenda looks like this evening. You know, I'm realizing now, as I'm probably 3-4 minutes in, I don't think I even introduced myself, so I apologize to everybody on that. My name is Kevin Lindsay. I'm a co-founder and director of operations for PathFinderEx. And when I'm not volunteering for PathFinderEx, I'm a deputy operations chief for mass care for the state of Oregon. Tonight, we're going to have two great speakers with us. Dr. Patricia Hosbach is a psychotherapist and consultant who's going to be talking to us about really kind of the lived experience and impact of surviving a catastrophe, some of the anxiety that goes along with preparedness, and some of the barriers that people face. So we're excited to have her here, and thank you, Dr. Hosbach. We also have with us tonight the 2021 Emergency Manager of the Year for the state of Oregon, Patience Winningham. So we're really excited to have her on here. She's going to talk to us about what it really means to be 2 weeks ready, and using sort of the city of Eugene as an example and talking about some of her experience as an emergency manager. So we're excited to have her on. And then we'll transition into a scenario-based forum where we'll ask some of our panelists, who will be introduced at that time, some questions, and hopefully elicit some feedback and questions from the audience as well. So we'll get into a little bit of how you can submit questions here in a moment. Facilitating that conversation will be our very own Dr. Oliver Wisco, who's a co-founder and president of PathFinderEx. He's also, when he's not volunteering with PathFinderEx, he's the director of cutaneous oncology at Brown University, and he manages his own practice in Bend, Oregon. He spent 24 years in the military as well, active duty reserves and Air National Guard, where he retired as a colonel. And while he was in the military, he commanded a medical response unit, a domestic medical response unit that focused on disaster response. So if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A portion of this Zoom. We do have a group of people in the background collecting those questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. All right, with that, I think we are on to our speakers. And I will hand it over to you, Dr. Hosbach.
Thank you, Kevin. Great to be here. And good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my story of being a survivor of the Holiday Farm fire that took place in the Mackenzie Valley just east of Eugene, Oregon in 2020. I'm going to share with you what I learned from living through that experience and what I learned about the psychological impacts of that disaster through working as a professional psychotherapist with my patients, many of whom were also survivors of the fire. I'll talk a little bit about what I see as potential barriers to preparedness, and finally I'm going to talk about how we might utilize anxiety and related emotions as motivators for preparing for natural disasters and man-made disasters. So next slide. And so to my story. And Kevin, can you change that next slide for me, please? Back, sorry. So on to my story. On the night of September 7th, 2020, just before 1 a.m., my bedside cell phone woke me up with an urgent alarm, a level 3 evacuation notice due to fire. Go now. I read and reread the message in disbelief, but it seemed unmistakable. This was us. Still not believing it was really happening, my husband called the non-emergency line at our local fire department and confirmed that it was indeed our area that was being evacuated. At the same time, a fire truck was rumbling down our rural road with a loudspeaker, ordering the neighborhood to evacuate now. We called an older couple who are dear friends that live on our road to be sure that they were awakened and knew that we needed to evacuate. And we arranged to meet them in the Thurston Shopping Center parking lot, a little closer to town. The lights had gone out about 9 p.m. that evening. At the time, we attributed the power loss to the 25-mile-per-hour winds that were blowing from the east, an unusual event for that time of year. And earlier that evening, I pulled in all the pots of flowers and shrubs that were on the patio closer to the house so they wouldn't get blown over and broken. And my husband and I went to bed that evening with no clue of what was going to be approaching. A fast-moving wildfire was sweeping from east to west through the Mackenzie Valley. Sparked by a down electrical line about 23 miles upriver and fueled by high winds, hot temperatures, and dry foliage on the ground from drought, the holiday farm fire was barreling toward us. Being awakened from a sound sleep with a level 3 evacuation alert, we didn't know if we had just minutes to leave or perhaps a little longer. So we threw on our clothes, we gathered our 2 dogs and their food and leashes. I emptied the important papers and valuables from our safe into a suitcase, and I gathered laptops, charging cords, phones, and my appointment book. I grabbed a gallon of water and a box of granola bars. And as I ran these items to the back door, my husband loaded them into my car. After getting the dog settled in the car, I had to run back into the house one last time to my nightstand and retrieve the 2 5-year journals that I had kept. I thought, if I lost everything in this fire, at least I would have those years of notes to jog my memory of our time there. When I went outside, the air was heavy with smoke and ash was already floating down. I had to stand on a stool to disconnect the garage door manually to open it and close it since we had no power. Meanwhile, my husband was firing up the RV we had serendipitously purchased just 3 weeks earlier. We were new to RV camping. We had stayed in it only 3 nights, but it was to become our home for the next 13 days. He took our golden retriever in the RV and I took our little Maltese in my car and we left with only the clothes we were wearing. I remembered driving away from our house, shaking and thinking I may never see it again. Entering the long line of cars, trucks, animal trailers, and RVs that were headed west on Route 126, I remember thinking, this is bad, and this could be worse. We weren't driving through flames as we had seen on the evening news reporting on the California fires earlier that week. We got to the parking lot and parked next to one another. And I remember spending the remainder of that night sitting up on the couch in the RV, watching dazed people in all sorts of vehicles pull into the parking lot. Many sat in their vehicles, some slept, and others gathered in small groups outside. The next morning, we secured a spot in an RV park near Coburg and watched the small TV in our vehicle and Facebook posts on our phones to understand what happened and to try to discern the fate of our home and gardens and beloved landscape along the Mackenzie River. It became clear this was a major wildfire. The fate of our home hung in the balance and was dependent on the direction of the winds and the first responders who were out there putting their lives on the line. As a result of the fires, the air quality in the Willamette Valley became among the worst in the world, and an orange glow was present in the sky for days. ash rained down and covered everything. It was a surreal experience to drive into town to get basic items and food. For even though I had my, quote, good jewelry with me from the safe, I did not have a clean change of clothes, not even a hairbrush. In the end, the holiday farm fire would consume over 173,000 acres and level hundreds of homes, businesses, and wildlife habitat in its path. The rural town of Blue River would be reduced to ashes. We had phone calls from neighbors who knew a first responder or someone who had been able to get down our road and report that the homes were still standing. We also heard from our insurance company, who had boots on the ground, that they had been to our property, and at that time, it was still there. But one night, we got a call from the insurance company to let us know that the fire was within 0.15 miles of our home. And it didn't sound good. After 13 excruciating days, residents were allowed to return home to see what was left of their property and to assess the damage. The National Guard had set up checkpoints to limit access to the area to residents only. And we were among the lucky ones. Though we had extensive outdoor damage and a lot of smoke damage indoors, we were alive, our home was intact, our rural road had been spared. We were filled with gratitude and relief. In the weeks and months that followed, I would see people in my therapy practice that had lost everything. One woman told me that there was no evidence that she had ever lived in the place that she once called home. Even a marble dining table was gone from the intensity of the fire. Another person shared that his gun safe and its contents had been reduced to a blob of melted metal. People lost beloved pets. Others said their dog had been found miles away days later. A friend who lived upriver shared that when she got back, she found her metal roof of her house sitting on its concrete foundation, and everything in between was gone. For many, the fire and its aftermath represented a loss of a way of life, a freedom of living in a wilder place. I've been in private practice as a psychotherapist for nearly 30 years. I work with people's emotions of anxiety and depression, with their relationships and their life transitions, and with their pain. In recent years, I've also specialized in working with people's relationships to the natural world, an emerging field called ecopsychology. But even with all that knowledge and all that experience, I struggled with the aftermath of the fire. It's important to understand what survivors of a disaster are experiencing emotionally as you try to attempt to help them move forward. Next slide, please. Many people will experience grief. There are a lot of losses involved in a disaster. Perhaps their home, perhaps even their livelihood, perhaps loss of life of someone they knew, loss of animals. There's a loss of this sense of place and sense of belonging. We have a name for the sense of losing a beloved place. It's called solastalgia. It's sort of like a homesickness, even though the place still exists. It may be unrecognizable. People experience a sense of vulnerability. We come face to face with the fact that there's a lot that's out of our control. Many people experience fear and anxiety that it could happen again. and they experience the sense of overwhelm of the cleanup and the insurance claims and all that has to happen. For some, it's too much, and they decide not to rebuild or return. But they also asked, where is safe? Some people talked about experiencing survivor's guilt. Some expressed concern about sharing their experience with others, that it had it so much worse. Why did my house survive and my neighbor's house did not? Some talk about experiencing depression, a deep sense of sadness, and feeling out of control. This was especially poignant amid a pandemic. Many report brain fog, not being able to think clearly and remember accurately. And some experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Over time, the psychological work shifts from survival to recovery. And I found my sessions with patients began including fostering resilience. They're coming back, clearing out, rebuilding, and digging in. Many talked about building community, reaching out to others, expressing appreciation to the firefighters and first responders and volunteers. Many began extending kindness or expressing their appreciation for kindness extended to them. Someone had left yellow mums at every burnt property one weekend. Many began to consciously draw on their own inner strength and on the strength of their relationships and connection to others. And there was the work of acceptance of the hard feelings, like fear and vulnerability. There was also feelings of empowerment to decide how to move forward and preparing for the next disaster. Some people began to talk about packing go bags, upgrading irrigation systems, considering generators and rooftop sprinkler systems. Next slide, please. Personally, we began working through the Red Cross 20 Weeks to Preparedness checklist to prepare for the next disaster. I swore I would never be so unprepared again. Each week, we purchased or gathered grocery items, hardware items, and worked through an assigned to-do list. Those go bags and bins are now clearly marked in the front of our garage, as you can see with the bright pink tape. I also copied important papers and secured them at another location. And now we keep our RV stocked with the basics. Taking these steps make us realize the limitations of what we can do and help to regain a sense of agency. Next slide. I'd like to talk briefly about what are some of the psychological barriers to preparedness. And it's really important to ask this question. If we can understand what gets in the way of preparedness, we can use that information constructively to help motivate people to get better prepared. As we think about it, we can draw on a parallel experience that many of us have had at some point in our life. Putting off drawing up a will or creating a power of attorney legal document or writing our advance directives for medical purposes. We have a hard time approaching the topic of the unthinkable happening to us and to our families. It's hard emotional work. Preparing for the loss of a beloved place or thinking about a disaster hitting our family and disrupting life is also hard emotional work. So we put it off or avoid it. We stick our head in the sand. We know we should prepare, but we avoid it. We avoid the unthinkable. And as Kevin mentioned earlier, there's this sense of overwhelm. Where do I start? If we can reframe the anxieties associated with natural disasters as normal and expected emotions, we can lessen the avoidance and use its energy productively. Next slide. So thoughts after a disaster that produce feelings of anxiety include no place is safe, and it can happen again. And we know that many natural disasters are tied to climate change. Studies point to the emotional impacts of climate change that can influence how readily we're willing to act. Worrying about the future of our planet and our well-being has become known as eco-anxiety. How do we prepare mentally for that go time? This has been a part of the work I've done with some of my patients as they move beyond the fire. We know that action is a strong antidote to worry and fear and depression. And the goal of preparedness is to create that sense of agency and sense of empowerment. I can't control whether a disaster is going to happen, but I can choose how I'll respond to it. This includes being as prepared as we can be. Discuss with your family, what are the disasters that are most likely to occur in your community? Create a disaster plan and practice it with your family. What are the escape routes in your house, on your property, and in your community? Identify a meeting place near your home and one outside the neighborhood. And identify a contact person outside of the community that family members can check in with if you get separated. Have a survival kit or go bag packed, including first aid items and items for kids and pets. And prepare your children. Talk to them in an age-appropriate way about how we're going to stay safe together. Connect with others in your area to talk about community preparedness. Next slide. A deep connection with the natural world is what brought many residents to the Mackenzie Valley. Today, though many of our foothills are bare of their trees, the residents are finding solace in the river that still runs wild and clean there, and in each other as they rebuild their neighborhoods and communities. Next slide. I hope what I shared with you this evening helps you understand a little better what the survivors of a natural disaster experience during an evacuation and post-disaster. Understand some of the psychological barriers to that preparedness, and understand how we might use anxiety and some of those hard emotions to motivate folks to get better prepared for the next disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hausbach. That was powerful. You know, I'll kind of reach out to Dr. Wisco and see are there any questions for Dr. Hausbach in the chat?
Thanks, Kevin. This is Oliver Wisco. Dr. Hausbach, one of the questions that was put in the chat was, our MRC volunteers met yesterday and there was a lot of talk of staying put and finding water. From your perspective, how would you respond to that?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, so the question is, our MRC volunteers, so the response volunteers met yesterday and there was a lot of talk about staying put and just finding water. So in other words, not evacuating. How would you respond to that?
Well, they would not have wanted to be in Blue River or in the area of the fire. Many times, and I mean, for us, water is just essential. And, you know, there's the thought, well, we could always boil water. We're right here by the river. But when there's such a fast moving events that happen in disasters like the wildfire here, you wouldn't want to stay put. You may have noticed on one of the boxes that we had on our shelves, there are multiple bottles of water that hopefully if we would have time to load into our car, we would be taking with us. But I heard a story from a patient. This person wasn't a patient, but the patient shared with me that they knew someone who did not want to evacuate and waited and finally ended up having to run for his life and take a piece of foam and try to float on the river to escape the fires. It was so powerful. So I don't think that staying in place would be something that I would want to do with this kind of a disaster.
Great. I think for time's sake, there's another question that was put in the chat, but I think I'll ask that at the very end. So I'm going to hand this back over to Kevin and we can move on from there.
Great. Thank you, Oliver. And thank you again, Dr. Hausbach. And I'm sure we'll have some more questions for you when we get into the forum. All right, so I'm going to now hand it over to Patience Winningham, who is the Lane County Emergency Manager. We appreciate you being on here, Patience, and you're going to talk to us a little bit about preparedness.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it. In the essence of time, I'm going to let Oliver run my slides, and I do believe I get about 10 minutes. So I want to say thank you to everybody that joined the webinar this evening. I saw a lot of names, familiar names from around the city of Eugene, where I really had spent a lot of my time learning about emergency management and the CERT program and the gaps and capabilities in the metro urban area. As many of you know, I actually live in the rural area. So I am a resident of McKenzie Bridge, the outside of the Holiday Farm Fire, but on the east side of the Holiday Farm Fire. And I'm also born and raised Blue River resident. I lovingly refer to myself as a river rat to some degree, born and raised, and actually raised my children in this community. So the Holiday Farm Fire really hit home for me because it was my home. I grew up there, and a number of my friends and family lost their homes in the wildfire, but they all knew I was the emergency manager, which led to a whole nother perspective, if you will, of the weight that it put on me as one of technically first responder and emergency management, but also an impacted citizen of the community. So the picture here on this slide, I want to call your attention. This is a fire in the Horse Creek complex in 2017. Which is from my parents' property, which is in McKenzie Bridge. And that was my first real experience in wildfire evacuation. We were put on a level 2 evacuation. And this was really when I started to think, wow, if we had to leave, embers they can fly up to 1 mile or 2 miles with a good wind. If I had to leave, what do I take with me? What do I need, and how fast can we go? So there's some advantages to advanced planning. And this was really that first opportunity. Many of you in the urban area, you aren't given that opportunity to think about, if I have to leave, and run through those paces, those decision-making processes. So I would say, if there are 2 things I want you to take from today, is advanced planning and communications will help you be stronger. This statement here is something I've brought along with me since 2016, and folks really like it. It resonated with them. But awareness is really the foundation of preparedness and builds our resilience as a community. So I'm going to go into some of those. You don't know what you don't know unless you ask, right? Unless I tell you, hey, did you know this is a huge gap? This is something that local government, federal government, state government, we can't do for you, and that we need to do that for ourselves as a community in order to build our resilience, right? So I'm going to take some time to really shed some light on that through my presentation here to the best of my ability. Next slide. So Dr. Hausbach had referred to the Holiday Farm Fire, and I want to give you a little bit of perspective here. Some of you may have seen this slide, but not everybody has. So the pink really illustrates the footprint of the Holiday Farm Fire and the magnitude of loss. Embedded in that are other fires historically from around the state of Oregon and their footprints inlaid in the Holiday Farm fire impact area. So you'll notice there on the far right, that's where my home is. My home is about 2 miles from the place where the Holiday Farm fire started. Next slide. I'm also providing the incident summary of overall Holiday Farm fire. This picture here with the truck, that was where I was standing on the east side of the fire. Around 7 p.m., I got a phone call from the fire chief that there was a fire, and I responded to the fire because my power went out and I lost all communications. As the emergency manager, I'm responsible in coordinating and supporting evacuation notifications to the members of the public. And I was standing here with law enforcement, the fire chief, search and rescue, and other partners, including ODOT and the like, and issuing emergency evacuation notifications from the parking lot at Blue Sky Market. It's important to note that there was an opportunity for me to take a minute and call somebody downriver. I called a member of my team and I asked him to drive to the high school where we were going to set up an initial evacuation point or an assembly point for people to go to while we started to evacuate what I thought was maybe a 1 mile perimeter. That quickly changed. Within an hour, the fire had moved far enough where we needed to move that shelter location to the city. Huge challenge for us in having that. I was also given an opportunity to call a family friend in Blue River, and most of you probably have met her, seen her name. I called Melanie, who we lovingly refer to as the town mayor, and I asked her to start grabbing her belongings and telling everybody to evacuate, that they needed to get on the road, don't ask questions. And I tell you, that was one of the most hardest conversations I had to have in my entire life, was to tell my best friend, or one of my very good friends, that she needed to leave her home and her business and try to get as many people out with her. And she started crying, and being an emergency manager, standing at an incident command post with a bunch of first responders, I had to tell her there's no crying in baseball. And that wasn't easy for me, but I think what makes it easier for me is that I get the opportunity to plan and think through the what ifs. My job pays me to do that. I get to think through these scenarios of what if this happens and what if that happens and what will we do, and think outside of the box, whereas most people just go about their lives and don't really think about the what ifs. So I challenge you to put some time into your advanced planning and think about the what ifs. Next slide. There are many threats to our area, and in the county, it runs from sea to summit. So it goes from the coast to the Cascades here in Lane County. Our population is somewhere around 375,000 people. While we have a combination of many dispatch centers, there are only one primary PSAPs in counties, and our primary PSAP generally has about 3 to 4 dispatchers available at any given time to answer 911 calls. So when you think about these catastrophic emergencies, who are you going to call when you need help? Now, you hear Dr. Hosbach talk about checking on her neighbors and calling the fire station. What if those fire staff weren't there? Who do you think the people in McKenzie Bridge called? They couldn't call that fire station, right? Understanding where you're getting information in advance of an emergency is imperative. And we drive really hard to build a culture of preparedness and a clear understanding of where you go to get information. So if you have not already followed us on the Lane County government webpage or Facebook page or our Twitter account, or you're not signed up for Nextdoor, I encourage you to go there. Find those sites and register and sign up. If you haven't signed up for Alert Me, sign up. Take a minute and say register for Lane County emergency alerts. That's one step in the direction to get emergent information for yourself, so that you're not spending time milling to make decisions for you, your family, and your neighbors. This picture here on the top left, again, is the Horse Creek Complex fire, and that's the street to my house. Dr. Hosbach talked about roads being closed. Well, in my advanced planning, if they close my road, how am I going to get to my stuff? How am I going to get home? I have to take with me what I can take with me. The couch can be replaced, my daughter cannot. The family painting can be replaced. The TV or the family painting can't be replaced, the TV can be replaced, right? And talking about where are we going to go when we do have to evacuate. Some people had trailers, some people had friends and family, other people are still living in hotel rooms to this day after the Holiday Farm fire. We really have to take the time to think through, where am I going to go if I have to leave? And where am I going to stay if it's a short term or if it's a long term? Checking your insurance policy is huge and imperative. This picture here with the snow and the cars, that was the 2012 snowstorm, 2014 snowstorm. Took me 6 hours to get home on the city bus, right? I had to think through, well, if that's just a snowstorm, how am I going to get home in a flood? Oh, I'm going to have a bigger go kit or a go bag. Where do I keep my go bag? I have one here in my office, I have one in my car, and I have one at home. The Holiday Farm fire was so extensive that I actually didn't get to go home for 27 days. I didn't get to see my husband for 27 days. He remained in Mackenzie Bridge with our dogs and our cat and helped all the elderly people that were so stubborn they chose not to leave. They were going to stay there until the road opened, right? And he wouldn't leave them. Those elderly folks that had been there for so long, he refused. I encourage you to remember, those of you that live in urban areas, whole communities burn. The bottom left picture there, that's Coffee Park. If you haven't looked it up, look it up. I encourage you to take a minute. The picture there on the right is the ice storm. Does everybody remember when Eugene looked like a crystal wonderland and the power was out for a long period of time? My job was really to work with our community partners to help those with the most need, the vulnerable populations, the elderly, the folks that couldn't meet their own needs. We got phone calls in our emergency operations center from an elderly couple in their 90s, no children, no friends or family, no power. She'd been helping him to the car for days to stay warm, and she finally had said she'd had enough. She needed assistance. And we went and picked them up. We took them to a hotel room where they could be warm, where there was power. Right? So it helps to check on your neighbors. Other folks called and said, I haven't seen my neighbor in 4 days. Could somebody come over and take a look? Can they check with them? Well, you know, sometimes it helps when you just go check on your neighbors, because that's one less thing we have to send a police officer for. That's one less thing that we have to dedicate very small resources to. And it just takes a handshake, walk across the street, shake their hand, say it's nice to meet you, build that relationship, because in our worst day, it really is going to come down to neighbors helping neighbors. Next slide. This is a picture of my husband in the snowstorm of 2019. So this was day 4 of my day on the job here at Lane County, which was my first federal disaster. And again, I live in Mackenzie Bridge. You see my house is behind him under that tree, and my car is under that tree. He had to drive me to work and return home to what was left of it in the snowstorm. So it's a family affair in emergency preparedness and first responder abilities. The picture on the right is my daughter. She's a wildland firefighter for the Forest Service. She was deployed to the Beachy Creek fire. She too got evacuated. When all communications failed, I had no idea where she was, if she was okay, what had happened across our entire state that day. Not one clue. But I did what I had to do, and that was my job. Protect the citizens of Lane County and work with first responders to meet the needs of our community in our worst day. And that's what I did. My first opportunity to even know how my daughter was or where she was when I talked to the state on a state briefing, when I told the fire marshal's office, take care of my daughter, she's out there somewhere. Luckily, we ended up in the same hotel room 2 days later in Eugene, where they'd moved the entire fire crew, which was a godsend. It was so amazing to see her. But I want to remind you to understand how you're communicating with your family. Have an out-of-state contact. Understand how you're going to talk to each other and where they're located. Again, my husband was in McKenzie Bridge where there was no power and there were no landlines. I had no way to talk to him until we got him a satellite phone. Know how to talk on a satellite phone. Get a GMRS radio. Talk with your community members and have a plan on how you're going to communicate within your community. That Amtrak train was day 5 of my job here at Lane County, with 182 souls on board, snowed in Oak Ridge. They were quickly running out of food and water, but they had power and they were warm. Next slide. So the lessons learned here is to plan for communications because they will fail. Whether you're a citizen or whether you're a first responder, you need to plan for what's next on my communications. What are your redundancies? Neighbors helping neighbors is imperative. I said it once, I'll say it again. Lane County has 374 or 75,000 people in it. And when we think about how many dispatchers, how many first responders, if we all took one moment to build that relationship with our neighbors, we're building resilience together. Look at your personal preparedness and start with fuel. How much gas is in your car? What sort of transportation do you have if you have to evacuate? Know where you're going to go and how you're going to get there. Sitting on your couch and taking 5 minutes to really think through those scenarios will only make you stronger. Have a go bag full of supplies to extend your stay. I told you I got stuck down here for 27 days and I only had 3 pairs of pants and 2 shirts. Didn't last long. Didn't last long. And when I'm working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet the needs of our community, there wasn't a lot of time for laundry. Plan for communications with your family. Take a minute and talk to your kids. Talk to your daughter, your son, your adult children, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles. And consider having to live without power. Depending on where you live, that has impacts on lots of your safety or your lines of safety. Without power in McKenzie Bridge, we have no water. Without power in McKenzie Bridge, we have no phones. Without power in McKenzie Bridge, we have no fuel. And think about how you would survive in an extended period of time. Try 2 weeks. Try 5 days. Try 1 night. Go turn off your breaker and go 1 night. That will identify what you need as a community member, as an individual, and what your comforts are, right? A good book, a puzzle, a candle, a lighter. It's the little things in life that will pay off dividends in an emergency that we clearly are experiencing on a regular basis. Next slide. All those systems I just mentioned, think about it. Water, fuel, electricity, communications, our first responder resources. People don't know it, but in Hurricane Katrina, only 27% of the first responder resources came back to work because they have families too. They have to respond to take care of their families. And some of them were responding to their families and couldn't meet the needs of the community. Those are decisions we have to make. Are my family safe? Can I go do my job? I can go do my job as soon as I know my family's safe. Next slide. So the recent events continue to test us as a community, right? They test with the snowstorm, they tested our infrastructure and our lifelines. The highway closed, Highway 58 closed. We couldn't move resources to that city, needed to move resources. flood and the wildfire, tested our alert and warning and our evacuation process here at the county level as first responders, but all the way down to the citizen level. What is a level 1? What's a level 2 mean? How do I get those alerts? Where do I get information? We've tested it, right? We're still testing it to this day so that everybody knows. COVID-19, economic impacts, the recovery, supply chain issues. We're learning all kinds of things every day, and with every disaster, it makes us stronger. And where you come in is picking up where you can be more prepared with your family and your friends and your neighbors. Next slide. Again, it starts at the individual level. That's you. That's our community members. That's me, right? What's in my go bag? That empowers me to be a stronger person to support you, right? And first responders are the first in and the last to leave. And I will stand on that podium forever, because we here in Lane County are here to support ourselves. We need to depend on us, especially in a Cascadia scenario, because we have what we have here to support us in a Cascadia scenario. So we need to be looking around our community and ensuring with the resources we have available here, we can sustain ourselves for a foreseeable future. So again, I challenge you all to do some advanced planning, establish some sort of communications with your family, and prepare. Go meet your neighbor. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Patience. That was great. Oliver, do we have any questions for Patience?
Yeah, thank you, Patience. That was wonderful. You mentioned all of the ways for Lane County residents to stay informed. For people who live outside of Lane County, what connections should they make now to ensure that they have up-to-date communications in the event of an emergency?
Sure, absolutely. Every county has an emergency manager, and you can probably Google emergency manager contact information, and they'll explain to you how you can get registered or signed up for emergency alerts specific to your county. And I know that there is a new system that many emergency management programs are signing up for. It's OR Alert, OR-Alert, which you could also Google that and get additional information on how to subscribe.
Great. There's another question. Does Lane County or Eugene have a zone system where the city is broken up to help better manage needs in a disaster?
The city of Eugene does have zones. Currently, I believe it's on their website. The Eugene Springfield Fire has wildfire evacuation zones, and the City of Eugene's emergency management program and this City of Springfield have broken the urban area into zones to help with distribution of resources, emergency notification and communications plans with individuals at the community level. In Lane County, we're working specifically with our fire districts and using those as zones, if you will, or areas to focus attention and resources. So I'll give two examples. Mohawk Fire District has an emergency preparedness committee, and it's being run through the fire district board, and they're building up caches of resources. They're doing advanced planning. They're building a team within their community. And McKenzie Bridge is also doing the same, using a community center and community members. I went out and gave a presentation or a training for community emergency response team training for that community, and they've identified 20 to 25 people that would report to the community center, which they've used in the last two events up there, the snowstorm as well as the wildfire, and it became a shelter for community members, and we sent resources there, including a refrigerator truck, food, medical care, and the like at that shelter during the Holiday Farm fire.
Great, thanks, Patience. Here's another question. What gaps in readiness have you seen widen in natural disaster readiness during the pandemic?
You know, I guess the first thing that comes to mind would be our ability to train and build relationships with individuals in a COVID environment has really been challenging. I'm a person that prefers to be in a room and shake hands and have conversations and build those relationships. And unfortunately, in a COVID environment, we have not been able to do that. I would really like to start doing some training and advanced planning, exercising with my community members, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. And unfortunately, we have not been able to do that.
Great. One last question, and then we'll move on. It was a follow-up to that GAPS question. What about other Northwest counties? Do you have any knowledge about furthering GAPS?
I don't think I could speak to my neighboring partners on what they can and can't do for their community, but I could tell you that one thing we're working on collectively and collaboratively is a Foundations of Emergency Management course. I'm an instructor, and some of my neighboring emergency managers are also instructors, and we'll be offering that course at the end of, I believe it's February. It's a 5-week class, and we're really going to be putting some time and effort into that to be able to empower our communities in that area.
Thanks so much, Peyton. A wonderful talk. Thank you for your responses. Kevin, let's go ahead and move on.
Great. Yeah, and thank you both again for your stories and for that great lecture. It's what it reminds me of is it almost feels like we wrote that PFX prepared manual together. A lot of those foundational things are in there. And I believe it was Patience that said preparedness is a family affair. I think I'm going to steal that from you, Patience. That's a really good way of putting it. So thank you for that. Right, Oliver, I think I'll steer for you here, but I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So for this next section, we're going to be having an open forum with several different members. The ones that will be primarily highlighted are our two amazing speakers, Dr. Patricia Hosbach and Patience Winningham. Kevin will also be joining us as a panelist, along with Greg Ramirez, who is part of the Oregon Army National Guard. He's the officer in charge of medical instruction for the 249th Regimental Training Institute. Also joining us will be Sonia McCormick. Sonia, she is the Public and Private Partnerships Program Manager at the State of Oregon Office of Emergency Management. And then one of our other speakers panelists will be Peter Mackwell, who is a Oregon Health Authority medical surge planner as well. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Kevin. Just to reiterate what Kevin had emphasized in the beginning, so save up your questions for the question and answer sessions. We have 3 questions already planned for our panel members. And I'm going to go through each of the panel members and have them answer the questions. But please, in the chat, put your presentations, put your questions in the chat, and we will answer those questions as we go along. Everything that has to do with that question that we just asked for follow-up clarification, and also we'll have just open question session at the end. Next slide. All right, so here's our first question, and I'd actually like to direct this question to Dr. Hosbach. Preparing is important, but it can also be a difficult conversation to have, especially with children. How do you prepare your family and practice how do you prepare your family and practice your plans without scaring your children?
Well, that's a great question, Oliver, and I think it's important to remember that as parents, it's our responsibility to lead by example. And preparation is the best way to handle difficult situations. So it's important that we talk to our kids. Information about natural disasters should come from you, from the parents, not from the media. And when we're talking about a severe weather-related event or some other natural disaster, it's important to stay calm. Provide age-appropriate information and details to them. They may have questions and answer their questions honestly. And depending on their age, plan to have a series of shorter conversations about it rather than try to kind of download all the information at one time. In thinking about getting prepared, it's important to have kids involved in creating a go bag for themselves. So you talk to your kids about what do they need and use every day, and ask them what they'd like to have with them if they have to leave home. Their checklist should include some comfort items like stuffed animals if they're young, games, some familiar items to help maintain some sense of normalcy for them, particularly if people are going to be away from the home for a longer period of time and we don't know when we take off in an evacuation. And it's important to remember to update those checklists every year, as their comfort items will likely change as they get older. And there's a lot of good resources online to help build a checklist. I think when we have kids involved in preparing the go bags, it's a lot of preliminary, easier thought for them. There's even some games on build a checklist and build a bag that I found online as I was thinking about what do we do for younger children. It's important to develop an evacuation plan that instructs everybody how to safely exit the home, and be sure that kids know where to go, what's a meeting place in the event that people would get separated, and who should they contact. For young kids, it's sometimes suggested that they have their contact information in their school bags. And for older kids, that they have those contact informations in their phones, because they usually have their phones with them. And have kids memorize people's phone numbers and their contact person. I think it's important that we practice disaster drills. When we practice what to do in an event of a disaster, it will help comfort kids if a real disaster occurs. And many children today are having this experience at school. So it may not be so strange to them to think about practicing for a disaster at home. And I think it's really important to remember kids look to their parents for comfort and support. If there is a disaster, first to calm yourself and talk to them about what happened and address their feelings and concerns, making space for that. Like so many times, parents are asked to give the most when we may have the least to give, with all the things that have to happen. But being there for your kids, seeing them strong and confident, if they see you strong and confident, they're going to feel a lot safer.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hosbach. Patience, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
I think that Dr. Hosbach covered it pretty well. And I know that the Red Cross has a really good program called the Pillowcase Project. And the Pillowcase Project is giving your children a pillowcase, essentially. And it's a way to practice and build that culture and have them go around their room and consider what are the things they're going to add to their pillowcase that they can take with them. Like, hey, we have to leave. These are the only things that you get to take, whatever you can fit in this bag. And it helps them understand, well, if we have to leave and we're not coming back, what would I put in my bag? And they get to start thinking through what they would take with them. I think that's a great way to approach that, the Pillowcase Project. That'd be the only thing I'd add.
Great. Thanks, Patience. I'm going to throw that question out over to Peter Mackwell. Peter, anything else you want to add?
Yeah. First, thank you, Patricia and Patience. Wonderful, wonderful talks. Lot of insight. I do have just a couple of general comments around go kits, and I understand it's a very personal thing for families, which makes it really easy. I just really encourage folks to look stay up on your Go Kit, and also revisit what's in there and make it timely for, you know, the season evacuation, you know, fire season versus snowmageddon. Yeah, and don't overlook, you know, you talk about an evacuation package. Don't overlook, you know, sturdy boots and stuff like that when you start thinking about, okay, I'm out of there, it's time to go back home and see what's there. In the case of a fire, you know, allow for enough PPEs and that, but a lot of this information is covered elsewhere. But I think, you know, the biggest piece I would add, you know, are the intangibles, the stuff that you can't put in your go bag. You know, simple little things like building the relationships with your community groups, like your MRC, your CERT, your MRC, CERT, search and rescue, and especially the volunteer fire departments, who pretty much know what's going on in their response area. So they're a very good resource, you know, under the guise of, you know, neighbor helping neighbor. And I think the only other words I would say on a Go Kit is, you know, organizationally, you know, the different response groups, the planning groups, is be very clear in what a Go Kit is. If you just generically say, hey, you've got a Go Kit, and the first thing I'm going to ask is, you know, what for? So very, you know, organizations be very explicit in, you know, in pack for different types of, you know, packing response bags. Don't just generically call it a Go Kit and say, everybody will understand that, because I guarantee you don't. So all I'm just encouraging to do is be very explicit in, you know, how you name stuff going out. But I don't want to, you know, belabor any of this. I think it's a very important topic. There's a lot of good information out there. You know, to tag on to Patience and Patricia, I would just really focus on those intangibles about being able to make those relationships that, you know, can help better inform, you know, your planning for Go Kits and being out there in the community with others that'll be able to help you.
Thank you, Peter. All right, so there's a bunch of other questions that are in the chat. There will be an open session, so please keep on throwing those questions out there. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go on to the next question. So Kevin, go ahead and move on to the next slide. All right, so I'm gonna throw this question out to Patience first. Counties have robust preparedness and response plans. However, we all know that after major disaster events, officials have to prioritize their response with scarce resources. How would you recommend that communities prepare together before an event to help you and first responders save lives after an event? So Patience, I'm gonna hand this one to you, and I'm gonna have Sonia and Greg follow up right after you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Oliver. I think I alluded to a lot of this in my presentation about neighbors helping neighbors and the Mohawk Valley Fire Department and their Emergency Preparedness Committee. It's really, again, us working together as community members to build those relationships and partnerships to support one another. So if we look at what first responders are capable of in a large-scale disaster and how many there are of them versus how many there are of us as community members, that further paints a picture of why it's important for us to be more prepared as individuals. I always use this one neighborhood, and I'm going to have to find another one, but I'm going to use this one for an example. The city of Eugene has the South Hill East Neighbors Association, and in that neighborhood specifically, there's right around 15,000 people in it. And with 15,000 people and a fire station, one fire station with generally 3 to 4 first responders in it, and if you had a Cascadia scenario or a wildfire scenario, you have to ask yourself, who's coming to help me? right? Who's gonna, am I gonna call 911 if it's a wildfire and we're evacuating? Am I gonna call 911 if it's an earthquake and everybody's impacted? What's my plan? And that's where I really drive home that, boy, if I sure knew the 10 people that live next to me, we'd have a pretty solid plan in place. And a lot of community members are working in that direction. So an example I'll give is Upper Mackenzie has continued to be impacted by disasters. One of them, Snowmageddon, and the other one, the wildfire. They're working with their community center, again, to train themselves, their community partners. They have written a grant and are applying for, and I do believe they were awarded 25 radios for their communications to build their plan for communications. And now they're moving their sites to a cache of resources. So now they're going to have a Connex box with food and water, medical supplies, cots, blankets. So when I talk to neighborhoods and neighbors, what can you do to help yourselves to lighten the burden for emergency responders or first responders? It's having a plan, right? Take some time, spend some time and energy, meet your neighbors, train, plan, and exercise. It's standard emergency management practice. So that would be what I'd encourage you to do.
Thanks, Patience. Sonia, would you like to add anything else?
That was fantastic, Patience. Yeah, I would absolutely underline what she said, educate and communicate. So educate yourselves on what the hazards are that you could face. Here in Oregon, we're lucky enough, almost all of them. And in addition, communicate. Like she said, build those partnerships with your neighbors. That's one thing in particular, the fires really brought up that memory of me doing that with my neighborhood association, reaching out when ash was raining down on us. Did you all know that there's an issue? Sure you did, but have you looked outside? We need to talk about this. And maybe what we need to do to save ourselves and our group. I love the idea too of reaching out, building a neighborhood organization. There are places also like Facebook that can do that. We have one in our community, it's several hundred members, and we do a lot of that communication back and forth in just regular blue sky days about all kinds of things. So I think definitely educate yourselves on what's out there, communicate. And of course, absolutely prepare yourselves as best as possible. I like to think of Go Kids myself are I have some backpacks. I have one at work, one in my car and one at home. And there are things that actually I would take on any trip, right? I could just grab one and go overnight anywhere. Includes toiletries and clothes and different things that are really important. But think of it that way as well. It doesn't have to necessarily be things that you buy that maybe you never use. I recommend using them and taking that bag on a trip and sort of sensitizing yourself to that use. It would help a lot. And always include a battery that can be recharged for your phones or little iPads or whatever the kids might use to keep themselves interested. That's really important. I used a lot of that during the ice storm last year, a lot of batteries. It was very helpful.
Thanks, Sonia. Greg, any follow-up comments?
Just the stories from Dr. Hausbach and Patience were just amazing and moving. And I think they're absolutely dead on with the recommendations. I couldn't agree more. I like this question in particular regarding scarce resources of officials. It always moves me when I see pictures of disaster response, like in Mexico City or in Japan after an earthquake. I ask people to pause and take a look at the picture for a while and remind them, you see no uniforms in many of those pictures immediately after the response. There are no uniforms. Those are neighbors helping neighbors. And I think that's the message that presses home for me, that makes it real and causes me to take action in my own community. And I think those of us on the panel and participating as viewers, we just need to take that call to action and decide that we're going to, in our own communities, get out and meet our neighbors and take those first steps, because again, all disasters are local, and those first responders, the actual true first responders, are going to be you and your neighbors.
Thank you so much, Greg. All right, let's go ahead and move over to the next question, Kevin, if you want to go to the next slide. And this next question, I'm going to have every one of the panel members briefly throw out their answer to this question. I have a go bag, and I'm willing to bet everyone on this panel does as well. Can you describe one unique item, something others may not have even considered in your go bag that you can't or won't go without, and why? Kevin, I'm actually going to have you answer this question first, if that's okay. Number one, just to describe a go bag, and I'll have you answer the question and then move on.
Yeah, I mean, very simply, I think Peter put it really well. A go bag can be different things for different reasons. You can have a 72-hour go bag to evacuate quickly. You can have a very specific go bag because you're a first responder and you have very specific duties. So, one of the things that I've experienced is that the basics in a go bag are pretty simple. We recognize that we need hygiene products, we need clothing, we need communications, we need that type of stuff. One thing that I've always brought with me during deployments, which I think is useful, is it's really helpful to just simply have a notebook and some pens with you. One of the things I've often found is you find yourself with very quiet time, a little bit too much time on your hand, and there is, I think, some utility in sort of decompressing that for yourself in the moment. And if journaling is something you're into, I find that to be very cathartic in moments of quiet reflection during an event. So that's something I always make sure is in there, some type of pen and paper that I can just sort of put pen to paper on when I need to.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to have Dr. Hosbach answer this next.
Well, I would have to agree that that pen and paper was a big deal for me as well. And it was illustrated in the fact when I had to run back into the house to pick up my couple journals that were important to me. I didn't have time to take a lot of other items and photo albums and that kind of thing. I didn't know what kind of time I had, but grabbing those couple of journals was really important. And I found that during the time that we were living in our little RV, writing the notes of what was happening was really important. And I had mentioned to Oliver at another time that I had a really hard time going back and even looking at those notes as I prepared for this talk. It brought up a lot of emotion, but for those of us who might be, a little introspective, having a place to get some of that out and write it out without necessarily burdening, whether it's our kids or our partner or whoever else is with us, was important. It was also really helpful that when I would get that call from the wildfire division of our insurance company, and it would come kind of unannounced and unexpected, I needed something to write very quickly on what they were telling me. So I was going to say a little notebook and a writing instrument would be something important for me, and a hairbrush. I learned that the hard way.
Thanks, Dr. Hosbach. Sonia, what would be that item that you can't live without?
Oh my goodness, that is an incredibly difficult question, actually, as I run through the things that I've got in my go bag. But I would say some things that I consider really important are things related to the stress of having to evacuate. And a couple of things that I have in there just to handle some of that stress, patients and I and all the panel, a lot of the folks on this panel have experienced, responding during some type of emergency. And typically, I've been in an operations center for 12 or 14 hours days working fires or ice or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of stress associated with that. So I actually have some things like an essential oil that just kind of reminds me of home, or something that smells really good that I can smell a little bit, and it kind of helps lower the stress level. And also something that maybe you like to eat a little bit, like a piece of chocolate. There's almost nothing better in a way of digging through your go bag during a stressful event and pulling out like a tiny candy. And you're like, oh, this is like a little jewel in the middle of some destruction. So a couple of just more intrinsic things related to the stress of evacuating for me.
Thanks, Sonia. Well, this doesn't have to do with evacuation. I was on survival training with the military, and I found an M&M in my bag, and I was so excited to have that M&M. Greg, what can you live without? What can you not live without?
Okay, my favorite item is the hand cranked solar powered radio. This one has a flashlight. It's solar powered, battery operated. There you go. Patience is showing it off. The reason for me that's my comfort item as well. So I can sit back and listen to the radio, or I can tune in to the weather report, or get emergency notifications as to what's going on in the world, and I can recharge my cell phone. So that is a one-stop must-have for me.
Great, thanks, Greg. Patience?
You know, for me, I have to be able to put my head in the game at work, which means I have to know that home is okay and the people, my family, are safe. And by doing that, it's that communications plan and knowing that that what we set in place is a solid plan. And I just want to, you know, drive that home again, that I have to feel comfortable that my children and my husband know what to do in our worst day, because I work 50 miles from where I live. And it could be a very long time before I'm able to get contact with them again. So with that said, I would say there's two things that are important. The satellite phone that we have at home will ensure that we have some sort of communications. And then I actually have two phones. So when it's time to upgrade my phone, I have an extra phone. If I break my new phone, I can take the SIM card out of this phone and put it in this phone and still be able to potentially make phone calls. So kind of like that old pair of tennis shoes, rather than donate the old pair of tennis shoes, put them under your bed so you have them if you need them. And then rather than give up that phone that may not be broken, just put that in your go bag so that you have it as a backup. And then Dr. Hosbach had referred to the insurance calls. I heard many people from the Holiday Farm fire explain to me how they did not have adequate homeowners insurance to cover their rebuild or to rebuild, cover the contents of their home. They had to painstakingly go through the inventory process of everything they lost, which took months to do. And I don't want to ever have to do that. So I went around my house and I videotaped everything in my home. I opened every single drawer, went outside and videotaped everything around my garages and my entire property. And then I uploaded it to my Google Drive. So now I have documented evidence of everything I owned, and I don't have to inventory it. I can just give that to my homeowner's insurance. And I also called my homeowner's insurance and made sure that I had adequate coverage to fund my rebuild and replace everything I own. And I didn't have adequate coverage. So I encourage everybody tomorrow morning, put it on your to-do list, call your insurance company and make sure you have adequate coverage if you were to lose your home.
Thanks, Patience. All right, well, we'll end with Peter, and then I'm going to hand it back over to Kevin for a second. Then I have a bunch of questions to ask in the open forum. So briefly, what would be your one thing that you want to make sure that's in your bag, Peter?
Oh, I mean, there's such a lot of good ideas, and I especially like what Kevin and Greg brought up. So there would actually be two things I'd take. I'd make sure I had a ham radio that can plug into a nice portable charger. But the thing for me with my medical background and being a responder for so long, I will not go anywhere without my medical kit. And yeah, and this is probably another whole go bag by itself, depending on where you end up when you evacuate. Medical resources may or may not be there, so it would be part of my out the door thing to keep looking after the community as we we'll work together to get out the other side of this evacuation kind of thing.
Thanks, Peter. Next slide, Kevin.
Yeah, so this is just a quick snapshot of what's in that PFX prepared. And, we talked about a lot of good ideas, and it's fascinating to me as we were going through the conversation today, how it kind of ticked along with what's in this PFX prepared. manual. So I highly encourage you to go download it. And here's really what it comes down to. It's pretty simple. It's about self-organization, self-organize yourself, self-organize your family, and then step outside and start to help your community self-organize after a disaster event. And so there's lots of good ideas in here. You heard a lot more good ideas on what can go into a go bag. There's also a page in the PFX Prepared Manual and the Neighborhood Ready Manual about 2-week ready kits, because it's not just about evacuation. It's also about what happens when you have to stay put for an extended period of time. And we've even seen some of that recently with the cold weather events, where it was just simply safer to stay in your house and not leave. And so, you know, I encourage you to take a look at the manual and see if this can spark some ideas for you. Also, a lot of the resources that were mentioned today, like the American Red Cross resources, they're linked right there in the manual. It'll take you to the American Red Cross page, and you can download their giant checklist there, and it's just got everything you need in it. So that's, I think, all I have to say on this, Oliver. And hopefully, and I will say the last thing: give us some feedback. Let us know how a manual like this works, and let us know what we can improve on. I'll hand it back to you, Oliver.
Great. Next slide, Kevin. All right, so we have several great questions. And the first question is, I live in an urban home. What's the safest place to keep your go bag? Basement, car, garage? And how do you keep up with expiring food? So I'm going to throw this question out to Sonia, Greg, and Peyton's. So let's start with Greg on this one.
Okay, for food, I've got a great simple way to making sure food doesn't expire. Is I just get regular normal food. And what I do is I rotate it annually. So every year around Thanksgiving time, I take my food that I've stored from last year, I take it to the food bank. I do my good deed, get my tax break, and help people at a time when they need it. And I renewed my food stores. So that's just a simple trick I use to rotate my food without ever having to think about it.
Greg, where would you keep your bag?
Oh, absolutely. This is a question I've been around and around for several years with several people, listening to people much smarter than me. The car. The reason being is the car goes with me to church, it goes with me shopping, it goes with me to school. My car is always with me. And if we have a winter breakdown, it's my breakdown kit as well.
Thanks, Ray. Sonia?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. What I do for rotating food out is every time I organize the garage, which is actually really frequent because I'm like that. I go through my go kit as well and just make sure things are not expired. And if they are, I bring them in the house and we eat them and use them. And I also wanted to mention, Greg came up with a really good suggestion of in the car. I second that motion. And I also would suggest, however, that don't leave it visible. I have actually run into that being taken from my car when it was visible. So I definitely recommend putting that under a seat or hiding it as best as you can. But great question.
Great, thanks, Sonia. Patience?
Yeah, I would have to concur about the car. One of the recommendations I made for not getting your kit ripped off out of your vehicle is having a clear box, because in your clear box may have your water and your flares and your vest and a blanket, and not a lot of people are going to steal that. Or going to the Goodwill and getting a hand-me-down duffel bag that people are going to think it's probably old gym clothes and they won't steal that, is another model that I would support for sure.
Great. Dr. Hosbach, I actually would love to get your input on that. Safest place to keep your bag, and how do you keep your food from expiring? Because I know that you're experienced with this. Unmute your
Sorry. We have two fairly large backpacks and two boxes that we packed that we're keeping in our garage at this point, thinking that when we're out here, that would be the easiest place to load it into the car. And we also keep the RV with some supplies that we didn't have the first time around because we had just gotten it and not used it. In terms of the food expiration, I found, particularly on canned goods and non-perishables, I used a black permanent marker to put the date really large on the end of the can and on the items, and made a notation in my little appointment book of when to check the food. So I was checking every 6 months is what I've done, and similarly just pulled it out ahead of time and made a note of what I needed to pick up at the grocery store to replace it. I really like the idea of keeping it in the car. And I think maybe through this conversation, what's coming through my mind is maybe a mini go bag that we have in each of our cars. But as of now, ours is in our garage, and the RV is ready to go.
Oliver, I missed the food part of it, and I just would make one recommendation in that I'm so busy and so far away. One of my model is Mountain House Food does buckets of food and their 25-year shelf life. So I started buying buckets of food for my family members and giving them for Christmas presents, because in 25 years, it's someone else's problem. And I don't have to plan that much, right? I just buy a bucket of food every year. So this year, my entire family got a bucket of chili mac and cheese. I was the celebrity in my house, just so you know.
There was a really good comment from Stephanie Frederick in the chat box. So canned goods can last for years. Look for swelling or damaged containers, sniff contents, otherwise don't worry. I thought that was a really good addition. Thanks, Stephanie. All right, so the next question I wanted to ask, I would like to start with Kevin on this one. Which is more critical to prepare, a go bag for evacuation or a shelter in place plan for remaining at home without power?
Yeah, it's difficult to say what's more important. The fact of the matter is, when we think about a typical evacuation scenario, you're typically going to move to a place that's probably more self-organized. You're not going to move to a place where there's less people or less material resources. So it is super important to have a go bag. I can't emphasize that enough. But a typical evacuation scenario will probably get you to a place with more resources than what you had at the beginning, or at least that's the goal. Now, the go bag is there to help you bridge that gap. You know, if that's a day gap, if that's 72 hours, whatever it takes you to get to safety, that's what that go bag is there for. But when we think about what it's required to shelter in place, that can sometimes be a little bit more complicated of a situation. We're talking potentially weeks and on Oregon's worst day. And so it's really important to make sure that you understand how you're going to maintain clean water and hygiene during a long duration of shelter in place. It's really important to consider, you know, how you're going to keep warm if you don't have, or cool, even if you don't have access to electricity. And those types of things can be kind of wicked problems when you think about them over the duration of weeks, which we would consider during Cascadia. So what I would say is they're both very important. I would be willing to bet that more people are ready to evacuate than they are ready to shelter in place for a long period of time. So I'd encourage people to think through that scenario.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Patience, do you want to add on to that?
I don't think so. Kevin really drove that one home. I really appreciated the perspective on the shelter in place. Is huge. I tried to tie it to my personal experience because I live so far away from the city that, you know, I think a lot of what we had to endure in the snowstorm and in the wildfire was living without power and fuel, and it's sheltering in place. So how much water and food do I have? And I remember going home, because remember in Snowmageddon, I was down here, my whole family was up there, but when I did go home was, I don't know, 6 days in, and they were trying to melt snow on the wood stove, and they're like, Mom, you didn't have enough water stored for us. You know, I was like, well, what? And they're like, it took forever to melt snow just to drink water. So I kind of owned a little bit of that. We have more water now. But yeah, shelter in place is huge.
Thanks, Patience. For time's sake, I do want to move on to just one more question, simply because we're running short on time. There was a question about, and I wanted to direct this over to Patience and Sonia, and also Peter, I was curious to learn more about the expected area of impact from the Cascadia subduction zone event. Does anybody have any information about how far inland we can expect to see major, moderate, and minor damage? How about I let Patience lead off on that one?
It depends. That's our catchphrase in emergency management, right, Sonia? It depends. It really depends on the type of earthquake and where the earthquake hits and what the potential magnitude of that earthquake is to really determine what the overall impacts are to us here in Lane County and then state of Oregon, Pacific Northwest. There are many tools and resources available on the web that you can take advantage of that can help you inform your way forward. HAZView, you can Google that, HAZVU. You can put in your address and it'll give you information about all the hazards around where you live and what the potential impacts could be, from seismic to landslide, liquefaction, and all those things. So I encourage everybody on this call to take a look at that. And then Sonia's been swimming more in Cascadia lately than myself, so I will let her add on to that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of folks maybe have seen the multicolored map of Oregon that sort of fades from red to intense shaking to orange and yellow to maybe slightly green throughout the state. And truly the answer is we don't know. They typically use the boundary. You'll see a lot of I-5, east and west of I-5. So sort of west of I-5 being more intense shaking and east less intense shaking to the mountains and then further. But I wouldn't rely on that 100%, partially because that has to do with soil and where your house is built. I think the HAZView is a fantastic idea. You can search your address and find, it comes up, there's a category that'll say as well, how much shaking you potentially have or how much damage you could potentially have and where you live. So, traditionally along the I-5 corridor, east and west, but that really is a blurred boundary. You're safer the farther east you go, and that includes into Idaho.
Thanks, Adrian. Peter, anything else you want to add? Question is, any information about how far inland we can expect to see major, moderate, and minor damage with the Cascadia subduction zone event?
Well, I would give the depends answer. Depends on, your structure. You may be quite a ways inland, maybe out in eastern Oregon, but you have a structure that's not designed to withstand earthquake. So it's, there's a lot of variation in that. And I think, tying it back into the discussion about, go kits, go bags, I would really be looking at your egress avenues and look at the potential places you have not to be able to get out. Is this area prone to landslide? Is this bridge going to be inaccessible? Is this overpass going to come down? And then, come up with all these what if scenarios and, base your actions on evaluations that you've already done. So I got to come back to what was said about we don't know. Depends on the type. It also depends on the season too. So too many variables to get to a specific answer for that. Just be prepared for your world and be very aware of your routes of travel.
Thanks, Peter. All right, Kevin, I'm going to hand this back over to you. There was some wonderful questions that I apologize I wasn't able to get to, and also I apologize for us running way long, but the discussions were just so wonderful and the questions out there were great. Kevin, I'm going to hand this back over to you, but leading into your final comments, there was a question about where are the CERT and NET teams in our volunteer system within PFX, and they're wondering how or whether we're coordinating with CERT teams or NET teams in Portland. And another similar question is how do we interface with CERT? So I'll have you answer that question as you lead us out of the summit today.
Yeah, it's a great question. Within the network of people who are interested in PathFinderEx, it's a lot of MRC, a lot of CERT, a lot of NET volunteers, and so the easiest way to answer your question is in the COVID environment. We've been doing a lot of virtual events. We founded ourselves with the hope of doing, in-person training and exercising and things like that. So maybe someday we will get there, and that is certainly, I think, the long haul goal. But the NETs, the CERTs, the MRCs in the state of Oregon, there's a lot of the folks probably in this room who are involved in those, and we certainly recognize the importance of those organizations and the importance of those volunteers. As a matter of fact, on February 5th, I'll be giving a little bit of a talk with some of the legislature on why it's so important to invest in MRCs. So it's definitely a focus point for us, and we're going to do everything we can to, wrap our arms around that community of volunteers out there. So with that being said, Oliver and the panel, I want to thank everybody for coming out here today and being part of this virtual event. This was really great. As Oliver mentioned, the conversation was fantastic. And for those that are still online, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you want to see in a new PFX prepared manual, what you want to hear in April, on April 25th, when we reconvene our next summit. So if you haven't given us your feedback, please do. And again, thank you everyone for your participation, and we'll close this out tonight.